Welcome to the Deep End at Wesleyan. This is a new podcast series exploring the ways that faculty, teachers, scholars at North Carolina Wesleyan University bring their research and scholarly work into the classroom to enrich and enliven our students' education. My name is Joe Lane. I'm honored to be the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at North Carolina Wesleyan. I have served as Provost at North Carolina Wesleyan for 3 years now, and during that time I have been so encouraged to see our faculty actively engaged in leading work in their fields. I'm excited to bring their stories to our listeners. If you are an alum, trustee, or friend of Wesleyan, you should be very proud to see the work our faculty are doing. If you're a student or a prospective student, I hope you will hear something that catches your ear and your interest. Perhaps you can find a professor whose class you would like to take or whose research team you would like to join. If you're a faculty member at Wesleyan, I hope you will be impressed with the work your colleagues are doing and will consider coming on a future episode to tell us about what you're up to. For this episode, I'm excited to be joined by two of our faculty members from very disparate disciplines. Dr. Amy Thompson is an assistant professor of biology who has served on our faculty since 2020. Her work, as we will learn shortly, focuses on dragonflies and aquatic ecosystems of marshes, fens, and swamps. Her partner in the project we will discuss today is Dr. Meredith Gringle, who's an assistant professor of public health. In her normal scholarship, Dr. Gringle focuses on issues surrounding maternal and child health in humans, not dragonflies. But today we have invited them here together to share how the surprising intersections in the Venn diagrams of their different research projects have proven to be fruitful spaces for collaboration. Dr. Thompson, Dr. Gringle, welcome to the Deep End. Let's dive right in.
Hi.
Hello.
First, I'd like to ask each of you to share a really brief account of how you came to study what you study. How did you find yourself where you are?
I'll go first.
Okay.
I'm Amy. I study dragonflies, and I found myself studying them because I used to be a national park ranger in Minnesota, and a colleague of mine said, hey, I have this friend who you should meet, and he gives citizen science trainings on identifying dragonflies, because there used to be what we joke as a Minnesota-shaped hole in the ranged map for dragonflies. And I met him, and we went out, and I caught a county record damselfly that had never been seen before in that county. And then I just became obsessed with dragonflies, and I wrote curricula about them, and then eventually decided to dedicate my career to studying them.
My story is going to sound so boring in comparison. So I actually tried very hard to get myself away from maternal and child health because while I was working on my PhD in the first year, I was working with my mentor, who now has become a member of a research team that I am still a part of, and we were doing some research around how the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, which is where I got my master's in public health and my PhD, and where I served on faculty until coming to Wesleyan, we were looking at how the institution supported pregnant and parenting students. And it was during the course of that work that I became pregnant with my first child. And I had this sort of really claustrophobic experience in which I felt like I was kind of pinning myself to the butterfly wing or the dragonfly board.
We don't pin dragonflies.
You don't, but you immobilize them.
Yeah, we do.
So I felt like a dragonfly immobilized, and I really did. I'm being light about it, but I was very interested in maternal health, but then also felt like a little attacked by the canon. And so that really shifted my career, and what I became really interested in was the tightness and claustrophobia of maternal health, and the way that public health is complicit in making motherhood a very narrow space, making mothers sort of into vessels, making mothers into access points for children, and how that can make mothers and maternal health invisible. And so that is kind of where I've stayed.
Until you met me.
Until I met you.
Now, what we're talking about today spins out of a U.S. Forest Service research project, Amy, that you were the original sort of progenitor of. Tell us a little bit about how that got started and how that work is evolving.
Yeah, so, I mean, one thing that is an overlap between public health and conservation biology. So I studied dragonflies, but my PhD is in conservation biology. And conservation biology is really about how humans can work to prevent species diversity loss. It has a value judgment built in, and that is that maintaining species diversity is good. And so, remind me of the question.
We asked about the U.S. Forest Service grant
yeah.
and kind of how it got
so,
started and how it's evolving.
An overlap between public health and conservation biology is that partnerships are more about relationships than they are about, say, like cooperative agreements or signing papers. Mm-hmm. And so I actually met the individuals of my partnership with the U.S. Forest Service at a talk I did at the University of Minnesota because somebody canceled last minute. Mm-hmm. And I enjoy public speaking. I'm not nervous about it. I always had something prepared to talk about, so my colleagues invited me to jump in. And I jumped in, and I made this talk that was supposed to be about monarch butterflies. I made it about feminism in science.
As one does.
And full confession here, without a lot of self-editing, I tend to have a bit of a potty mouth. And I did swear a couple times in this talk because I didn't do my Zen preparation beforehand. And afterwards, I got a note from my now partner, Karen Theophile at the U.S. Forest Service, and she's like, "That was the best talk I've heard in a long time." She's like, "There was so much passion," and she's like, "Just sprinkled in the right amount of profanity." And then she's like, "You and I should talk." So that was, 6 or 7 years ago, and she works in the International Programs Division of the U.S. Forest Service, and they're also really interested in community engagement, which are my two biggest passions: community science, community engagement, and dragonfly movement. And because common green darners, my species I study, migrates internationally, it falls under the purview of their Wings Across the Americas program. So they're interested in animals that cross the Canadian and Mexican border as they migrate. And we have been working together, tweaking our focus every year. Mm-hmm. And this past summer, they allowed me to expand my focus to include public health and One Health initiative. And that's, what Meredith and I have been working together on.
And so this perspective on public health and becomes the gateway for your collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it was originally, our gateway was, again, just that we got along really well. So I think there's this falsehood that to start a partnership, you have to be like professional, let's sign a paper and shake hands and now we are partners. It's just like, who do you like? Who do you get along with? When you talk with somebody, what energies pop up and you're like, oh. And Meredith we had that almost instantly the first time we met.
We did.
And then we were having, it was lunch or dinner at a restaurant, and we were you were talking about one of the challenges of something in public health. What was it? And I was like, we have that same challenge in conservation biology. And all of a sudden we talked more and more and more, and the Venn diagrams that we thought were separate started to overlap so much that we got really jazzed about working together.
I think one of the things that knits us together, both individually and also as representatives of our discipline, is that in order to realize authentic community partnership, you have to shed the preciousness of the academy. Mm-hmm. And you have to shed the tightness of discipline. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that can be really challenging because of the ways that so many of us come up. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that one of the things that connected us to each other right away is that we were meeting in this very academic space, but connecting in this very sort of moving from super sort of academic, theoretical thinking into just, the kind of material conditions of our lives and back again. Mm-hmm. And that both of us were like, isn't it interesting to be able to have these kinds of rounded, holistic conversations in which we can we can recognize mm-hmm. that we're brought together in mm-hmm. the academy, but also even in our interactions, like immediately start breaking that, immediately mm-hmm. start sort of defying the idea that we're just gonna, engage like collegially, whatever that means. And so I think that that translational impulse in public health and in conservation biology became so clear because we're like, oh, this is weird. We talk in the same way.
Yeah. And in the same way that has caused us to feel some exclusion within academia.
Yes.
You know, what makes us successful in community engagement is what makes us outside of it in academia.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so I think we sort of bonded over that. But when you're working, like, so both public health and conservation biology are at their heart about humans. Conservation biologists may get some ruffled feathers about this, but it's really about human health. And one thing I think that ecology, this is what we were talking about, I think, handles maybe a little bit better than public health, and I'd like to hear if you disagree, is playing in complexity. You know, like, ecologists are very comfortable in the complex world and saying, I'm going to study just this piece and not worry too much about all the other pieces that connect. I'm going to acknowledge that they're there, but I'm also just going to be okay with isolating my vision on this bit. Because I think when we were talking about One Health and its kind of fits and starts, that maybe was part of its problem. Because remember you said it was like they're just focusing like on rabies or...
Yeah, you know, I think public health has a lot of ambivalence about itself, and this, you know, I imagine that this disclaimer is built in, but this is just my perspective in a certain corner of public health. You know, I'm sort of in the critical public health domain, and so what that means is that I love this field very much, but like you will find me crossing my arms and raising one eyebrow and being very sassy about sort of the public health status quo. And I think that, you know, public health is really invested in not just health as the absence of disease, and this is, you know, stated by the WHO. Like this is decades and decades and decades of definitional sort of adherence, right? Like we're not just interested in preventing disease, and health isn't just not having disease. Health is being able to experience the conditions in which you can be your sort of most realized and actualized self. But actually getting there, trying to figure out what are the steps to facilitate the conditions that people need in order to realize their most actualized health is such a complex conundrum that I think what we tend to do is then use strategies that really center disease occurrence as the outcome of interest, but that is in defiance of our stated definition of health. And so I think that's a really interesting dialectic, right? Like I think that's really, and I think that for ecologists, you know, I think we're all capable of sort of centering in on our little squares, right? Like our minute spaces, right? Yeah.
This is what academic life encourages us always to do, right?
Yes, it is. But you know, that is like a tension point for me in academia because I actually don't like that. Like you know, in maternal health, I so appreciate you bringing that up because I actually think that's something that brings us together. It's like, you know, when I am asked to go very, very deep, I miss that breadth, and it makes me, it actually. Yeah, right. Like it makes me feel a little stifled. It it makes me a little frustrated, a little annoyed. It actually kind of makes me like even more cross-armed and even more like, you know, resistant to the dominant paradigm.
And it puts off the people we're trying to engage.
Yes.
When we put ourselves in this ivory tower, we're separating ourselves from the community who we're supposed to be serving. And I feel like one thing that you and I both pounced on, especially when we started collaborating, when we started thinking what does it look like on the ground, was the power of play.
Yes.
Because what we ended up doing, can I segue into this?
Please.
So what we ended up doing is partnering on a project that was based in Ohio, because I had some footing there, and we knew that the citizens of Cleveland, we partnered with Cleveland Metro Parks, thanks to the facilitation of the U.S. Forest Service, we know the community in Cleveland prioritizes nature experiences because they have an extremely robust public-funded nature system, the Metro Parks. So we knew we were already, the community had told us already they were interested in nature experiences. And so we had two kind of things. We had, my research is with the Forest Service is about how do we track dragonflies while they migrate. And so I had new trackers I wanted to test out that I could glue onto the dragonflies. And then we also, this idea of migration and movement and finding home is also a very human concept. And that really rung true, I think, with Meredith.
Yes.
So we designed an experience at a nature center who was a delightful partner where we let people, first of all, we brought them in with play. They walked into the door. We had this huge, glorious, sparkly setup with interpretive signs and markers and crayons and people and energy and nets. And we gave them dragonfly nets and we said, go catch dragonflies. So they were like, oh, okay. And they would go out and they catch dragonflies and they bring them back. And me and my scientific team, my conservation biology team, we glued the transmitters onto them while everybody was watching. And then we gave them, once the glue dried, we gave them back to the participants and they could release them. But also inside that space, we had interactive exhibits set up that asked them about the past, present, and future of their families and their movements. And what caused them to move? How do you define home? And we were able to pull some really exciting and interesting themes from what does home mean for people and where did their families come from? And that has led to a to be determined future. We haven't analyzed all that data yet, but just by looking at it on the surface level, some interesting themes have popped up.
I think it's just really remarkable that a funded scientific study could culminate in something so whimsical as a dragonfly festival. I think it upsets a lot of our paradigms about the earnest seriousness with which we ought to be trying to learn things, and plays into something you all were talking about earlier, that the way you all learn things is also about doing things. The two are very intertwined. Where do you see yourself going with this? Where are some of the places you want to migrate in this work in the future?
I see what you did there.
Well, actually, okay, so before, do you have a thought that you want to share with
I always have thoughts, but you can go.
So I think before, I would like to, if I may, I like that question, but I would like to decenter us a little.
Yes, please.
Because I think for me that's such a good point about the movement as part of meaning making and how that might crash into earnestness and seriousness. And like, I often talk about public health as, you know, really existing at the intersection of seriousness and playfulness. What does serious play mean? And I'm so interested in this idea of movement, and I want to share something that I was witness to during this event. So while you and your team were catching dragonflies, immobilizing dragonflies, which is a fascinating, like, it just, the way that you were able to handle these insects and not hurt them is remarkable. I was having an interaction with a community member, and she was, I would say probably 60-ish. And she came up to me and she said, I don't really understand your questions about humans and migrating. I don't get that. And I said, yeah, okay. What's coming up for you? And she said, well, I get that dragonflies migrate, but like people immigrate. They don't migrate. And I'm like, yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm like, I'm really curious to hear more. You know, I wonder, you know, as you sort of work your way around this space in this room, where we have these, you know, these sort of questions that are asking about human movement and linking it to opportunities to think about, why do we draw these distinctions between the ways that animals move and the ways that we move, and what does that do? Like, can we hold a lot of space for that? And she said, ugh. and then I watched her, and she went outside. She grabbed a net and went outside. And then she came back in. Right? So there's movement here, right? Like, she comes back in, and I'm watching her walk around. And she comes back to me and she says, okay, well, there are snowbirds. And I'm like, snowbirds. And she goes, yeah, like, I have friends that go to Florida. And I'm like, interesting. And she's like, and we call them snowbirds, but they're people. She's like, I guess that's kind of migrating because they go to Florida for the winter. And I said, yeah, I think that, and how interesting too that like we use the language of birds to describe that movement. I think that's actually like really connecting to your point about like, immigration versus migration and like this sort of species. I did not say species supremacy, but that is what I'm going to say now. And she said, yeah, okay. And then I watched her move around a little more. And I watched her sort of go back to some of the spaces of the exhibit and pause a little bit. And then...
Can you just pause?
No. You guys...
I came out... It's because I'm blowing your ears out because my voice is so loud. And she came back a third time, like on the third cycle, and she said, okay, well, I completed those interactive cards. I did it. And I think that is so, for me, part of it is the joy of the work, but it is also the ethics of the work.
Yes.
Is creating the spaces, not necessarily that are centered on my own movement, but that facilitate that kind of movement and that facilitate the kind of learning of being there that you were talking about. And that like when we are doing things, what does it mean to have an opportunity to remove yourself from the space when you need to and to keep re-engaging, and how does that help us think about when we are trying to engage with community, when we're trying to engage with our students, when we're trying to engage with our colleagues, what does it mean to really hold that spaciousness and to also recognize that our learning should upset our paradigms. That community engagement, I mean, I'm gonna...
It should upset our academic paradigms.
Yes, right. And that, like, public health is really trying to work towards decolonization and really recognizing that, like, hey, we can't just throw a fishing net over an issue and say it's health. We have to listen. We have to think about, really decentering our own selves disciplinarily, really decentering the idea of expertise, and remembering that like sometimes my expertise, and this is such I'm like, this is kind of coming up for me right now, like what an interesting sort of reconfiguration of vessel. I started off in public health being like, I hate this. I hate that I feel like I am complicit in like making my own self and also mothers like me a vessel. In this work, vesselness is an expansive space.
Yes.
It's holding that room for playfulness, and that feels like this is just occurring to me now. I'm wondering, what's coming up for you about that?
Well, I mean, this is something you and I have talked about a lot. It's like you really to be successful with community-based work, citizen science, and the like, you have to trust the community. And academics hate this, and I'm generalizing it, because we see the solution, or we think we see the solution, and oftentimes like in NSF grant applications you have to be like, how is this going to be engaged with the community? We sort of BS that part, and for it to be successful it has to be genuine.
Because it's covered on the rubric, and you just need to check the box.
I mean, that's what a lot of people view.
Yeah.
Right.
And the community engagement process is messy, it's iterative, but the title says it all. You are engaging the community. And I think a lot of times, because we are academics, we've studied this, the conclusion that the community engagement process comes to is the one we would have predicted anyway. And so that some academics then feel like this process was a waste of time. It's like, well, we come to the same conclusion anyway. But no, it's the process of engaging that has the power. And oftentimes it'll give us a surprise. And the process is never done. Never done. It's constant. And when we say trusting the communities, it goes back to those relationships. So as we saw in Cleveland, not only did we impact us, our team, I would definitely say it was a transformative experience for all of us. Not only did the people that participated have a really meaningful experience that we can have evidence of based on the data we collected from them giving us responses, but we got feedback from the Nature Center manager and employees about how that changed their perspective on their community. So as academics, and I think your timing is perfect, our next step is I have some, like with the research with the trackers, I have some clear next steps, but the rest of it has to be determined by our community and our partners. And that will be influenced by money, that will be influenced by politics, that will be influenced by, does somebody in our network get a new job somewhere else? Are they going to want, so maybe somebody in Cleveland gets a job in Seattle. Do we move to Seattle then, or do we try and stay working in Cleveland? So And one more thing, as long as I'm on my soapbox here, a lot of conservation biologists, and I think this is a similar thing, we get sort of hoity-toity about we're doing this for the world, for Mother Nature, for the animals, and that is just not true. In geologic time, after humans go extinct, Mother Nature, the world, the animals, we're all going to be here. We're doing this because when we lower diversity, our ecosystems become less robust and they can no longer give us the ecosystem services that we enjoy as humans. So we need to just own up that what we're doing is for humans in the community and take off sort of our, pride.
Mm-hmm.
And that really strongly, I think, overlaps with public health. Like, we're not going to accomplish what we want to accomplish if we aren't humble and we aren't adaptable and we don't embrace the messy and the iterative process and you're willing to listen and learn. So I think decentering us is really like what we need to say. Like, what's next? Well, more community engagement, whatever that means. If we can get funding, I don't know what's going to happen in the future.
It really does. It puts some pressure on the idea of expertise too, doesn't it? Which I think, there is this, I often think about it as sort of like, it's a little bit of exquisite vulnerability, I think, because, I obviously, as a member of the academy, I love the academy and worked hard to sort of prove myself within this structure, and also recognize that it has done some significant damage to how I am able to form relationship, because sometimes the relationships that I need to form that emerge out of messy coalition bang right into what I've been trained to regard in a sort of self-righteous way about my own expertise. And what does it mean to negotiate that? Not to, because I think that it would not be the truth for me to sort of pretend that my expertise doesn't exist or that it's not important to me. It is. And how do I use it? That I can't wield it like a specter, right? Like I can't come in on high and tell folks anywhere, all right, here's what I know about health, here's what I know about you, and here's what we're going to do. It just doesn't work. Like, we see it empirically over and over and over again. Like, those projects that are sort of projected upon.
Yep.
They might make us feel good, right? Like, we could get a publication out of it. We could sort of like applaud ourselves. But when we're really thinking about, okay, if we are trying to work for the better good, whatever that means, that has to be in cooperation. And what that means is that I'm learning far more than I'm teaching. And I am humbled far more than I am righteous. And I am a vessel far more than perhaps I want to be, because I want to be an agent and I want to be controlling things and I want to be in power and I want to tell the story. I want to tell the story. What I've had to learn how to do is shut up.
Yeah.
And that, that process, I think, is so vital and so humbling and so hard, right?
The irony is, like, we're sitting here talking.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And like, look at, like, this is like that like really fascinating tension between, at once, like, absolutely egocentrically venerating my expertise and also recognizing that, like, what is it worth if I cannot work towards the stated aims of my discipline? And those two things often are not in easy concert.
No. Well, I mean, you and I we use this phrase a lot when we talk about what we do, and it's making the space. So when we do community engagement work, and when we teach, it's not content-based, it's space-based. And it could be a metaphorical space, it could be literal space, or some combination of the two, and then we let what happens in that space be, and we observe and facilitate and protect. When we have really controversial issues, we've talked about the need to develop some norms to protect from somebody that may be in an emotional state that's sort of harming the others, to facilitate repair. And the reason this is so important and so tricky is it parallels a lot of things in our societies that we don't like to talk about, with privilege and power and wealth. And so to navigate those aspects of conservation biology or public health, we start at the community level, and the communities are often really hesitant. They don't feel safe saying their authentic thoughts. So another phrase that Meredith and I have started using is this idea of quiet thoughts. We need to make a space where people can express their quiet thoughts, which means maybe ones that are based in fear or frustration or doubt, or one that the thinker thinks may not be welcome in the space or even punished if they speak it, or thoughts maybe that aren't fully formed yet, or maybe a thought that they worry has already been discussed to death. But if that's still in their head, we need to have these discussions to get at what the truths are. And these truths are often very tender. But if we want to create meaningful change, either in public health or conservation biology or in the overlapping world, we do need to uncover those truths really respectfully and delicately.
That's a good way of thinking about that, respectfully and delicately, how you bring this into the classroom. So you all have a moment of scientific shared community where you all are simultaneously an expert, but also part of a community engaging with, a particular region, a particular species, a particular set of migrations. And then you come back to North Carolina Wesleyan, and you have to bring that experience and the insight you have from that into a classroom with students who aren't there. How does that work? How do they take on part of the space? And how do you empower them to go forward and create spaces themselves?
Well, I think they are the space. And I think that, again, as my teaching has developed over the years, I recognize that really at the end of semesters, we're at the end of our semester, the best semesters I have, I come out really recognizing how much I have learned and how much I have been stretched. I'm thinking a lot here about, if we think about the sort of ethos that undergirds this work, that really allowed for the sort of like fruitful space of this collaboration of our experience in Cleveland, and bringing, certainly we bring topics into our classrooms that are appropriate for our disciplines, but also perhaps most importantly, we bring that ethos in. And there's something that's coming up for me, and I think it relates, but I'm not quite sure how, so y'all, let's play with this. There's something that links the ideation of conservation and healthiness together in a tight way, that there is some tightness there, that I think is really let loose if we shift towards restoration. And what does restoration offer us in terms of, one, shifting our ethos to recognize that in order, I think, to work towards equity, because I think that, equity is really one of the heart chambers of both conservation biology and public health, is that we are really committed to equity, at least stated. Part of equity, I think, is recognizing that we are all complicit in power structures that do not work towards that, and that when we use the discourses widely understood as conservation, when we use the discourses of healthy, that we can actually really do damage. And I think for me, to circle this into the classroom conversation, I think that in a restorative classroom, we recognize that our students are teachers who have perhaps not been venerated, their expertise has not been well held, that they have not been consulted, that their learning has not been consensual, that their critical thinking has been marginalized in the name of expertise. And so what does it mean to think of a classroom as a restorative space and restoration as one of the pathways to equity? And then if you start from that place of ethos, then the lens that we sort of not are allowed to, but that we can apply to, that we can use to look at the topics in our disciplines, I think that knits us together as well.
It very much does. So a lot of my teaching has been informed but you articulated it more beautifully than I could. My science mind is like, mer, mer, mer. But there's a paper, I pulled it up so I can get the title right. It's called The Tyranny of Content Coverage as a Barrier to Evidence-Based Teaching Approaches and Ways to Overcome It. It's by Christina Peterson and many others. And this talks about, like, you use the phrase lens, and I like that. And also, it's how do we respect all the different learners? How do we repair the damage that they've been caused in their curiosity? It's focusing on methods of, I use the framework claims, evidence, and reasoning. And the reasoning is the knowledge, and it's only this much about what they need to know. I want my students to be really powerful, liberated critical thinkers, and they can take whatever life experiences they have had and let that form their questions and their answers, and then teach them how to gather evidence that supports their interpretation of their experiences, and then tie that into the knowledge of whatever they're interested in. So the Tyranny of Content paper suggests one way of doing that is to take just a small blob of something and the topic, the knowledge, like it could be dragonflies, it could be anything, whatever the topic is, and then teach them how to think like the professionals in that field. Like I teach an invertebrate zoology course. Invertebrates are like 90 plus percent of all the animals in the world. There's no way I'm going to be able to teach my students about every single invertebrate phylum, much less species, but I can teach them
memorize all the insects.
Yes. And that's even insects is
right.
But I can teach them how to think like invertebrate zoologists think, and I can make the space of learning safe and welcoming for them. So do they learn how do they want it, and then we share a lot. We interact a lot. And so it's again about making the space. It's again about embracing the messy and the iterative. And my way of grading is I grade effort more than I grade expression of pure correctness and knowledge. Because if I were to get tested, if I were to go back into any of my graduate school classes and take those tests, I would probably flunk them. And that does not mean I'm a bad entomologist or a bad conservation biologist. It just is like this not... The reason I got my PhD is because I was given the opportunity to think independently and critically, not because I could identify every dragonfly east of the Mississippi, which I can't, by the way. So
I'm sure not. There are a lot.
There are a lot, yeah.
Well, and there's we shouldn't have to earn our curiosity.
Yes.
And I think that feels so vital. I'm gonna come back to this vessel thing because clearly my brain is just like ticking on it.
This was the last day of classes for our listeners to know that we were operating.
We're our wildest
all
selves.
Debriefing
Exactly, that's right.
Yes.
But I think that there, when I had a lovely pedagogy teacher when I was in grad school. So I want to be really careful that I'm not complaining nor accusing about my training, except in sort of academic generalities. But I do think that we are trained to think about learners as vessels, and that we pour our expertise into the vessel of our students and prepare them to pour their expertise into the vessel of whatever. And I think that's a very colonial idea. I think that's a very, to me, that that gets us farther from restoration. Because somehow if I can just fill you correctly, but really we are both the container and in the container. And what does it mean to learn, recognizing that, I am as much in the vessel as I am the vessel with you, and we're all sloshing around together. And how can that, centering our collective learning in that kind of water, in that kind of fluidity, what does that bring forth? And then, how can I engage my expertise to think about this more as a kaleidoscopic process, to think about, okay, critical thinking is not being able to derive the same answer over and over again, right? Critical thinking is being able to sort of think about your evidence. Well, maybe it is deriving your answer over and over again.
Yeah.
I mean, tell me what's coming up for you.
Well, so I think one way that our worlds complement each other is you have a qualitative data set.
Yes.
And my data set, generally speaking, is quantitative. And if I can't replicate my results, I'm doing something wrong. But that doesn't mean that my question can't be changed or the tweaks on it can't be changed. Like, so in my classroom, in my ecology class, methods class, we all do an experiment, but each of my students usually has a different framework within it, a different introduction and a different discussion, because they see, like, we did camera traps this semester, and some of them are only interested in the fox. Some of them are interested in areas that we saw humans, did we see fewer animals? Or some of them are interested in day-night patterns. You know, which species do we see during the day and the day? So it's the same data set that they are using, but they're framing it with different questions.
I really appreciate that. I think that's exactly right. So I want to be careful, you know, not to sort of suggest that qualitative research is evidence-free, but that if we pay attention to the generation of the question and remembering that our questions come from somewhere, and sort of remembering that, you know, the way we ask the question is going to set us up to answer it.
Yes.
And that is across methodologies, that's across disciplines. And so okay, so I have a question for you then.
Ooh, goody, I like
what
questions.
Does understanding that the question that we ask is going to show up in the knowledge that we generate, and that the questions that we don't know to ask or that we dare not ask, that they kind of wander around ghosty, and what do we do with that?
Yeah,
what
it's
is
like
our
the
relationship
dark
with
matter of science.
Yeah, totally. I say yeah, totally. Like I know what that is. It sounds good.
But the questions we're not asking do influence the questions that we are.
Yeah,
they still exist. They still are like pushing. There's tension there, and that's where the process of listening and creating a restorative space is really important, because people of other experiences are going to ask different questions than us. You know, and I think, you know, one way that I bump into this in my classroom a lot is when we say, especially with, you know, invertebrate zoology, or, you know, when the history of science knowledge is dominated by publications that were made by white men. And so we were talking about the evolution of birds in North America, you know, and so there was one thing was like Meriwether Lewis was the first to observe that this bird had a different call on the east and west coast. And I like paused this video and I'm like, do we really think Meriwether Lewis was the first person to observe this? You know, and then it's like, what questions this would probably be ridiculously obvious to the indigenous peoples, you know. And so the context of the question asker matters. And when we talk about the process of science, as we're talking about now, the development of the question and the execution of the research, also then we get into what do you do with your results. And that is also very colonial. We publish in these journals, you know, and so you can say, I was the first person to discover this if it's the first time it was published in a scientific journal. And that is a very narrow academic way of knowing.
And because of the way that quantitative research is held, we also only publish if there is, quote, significance.
Yeah, we don't publish null results.
Right, and yet, like, when something doesn't happen, that is absolutely part of the story. Yeah, so I'm thinking so much about, you know, when we are preparing our students for the messy coalition work that is going to be so vital in the academy, out of the academy, and really thinking about, right, we are asking different questions, and the strategies have to be sound in the answering of the questions. And I think that is such an important point to sort of remember that what I don't want to advocate for and what I don't advocate for is the idea that, like, evidence doesn't matter, or like everything is just so fluffy and expanded and elastic.
Right, but what we need to do, I'm sorry for cutting you off.
Please, no.
We all have sort of academic generational trauma, right? Because, like, most of us that went through the process of getting our PhDs, what was like considered sexy in academia was being able to cut somebody else down. You know, and so I think what we have to do is like stop that trauma in its tracks and not be like, well, I went through it, so you have to go through it. I would really like us shift into seeing how do we uplift each other, you know, and find safety in being like, well, this is a mistake. I think this paragraph here is going down the wrong path, but not have that be something vengeful and vindictive or feel like, ha, I've got you. You know, it would be like an honor to have somebody be like, hey, I'm investing my emotional energy, my time, my intellectual energy into this, and let's make it better together.
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting to just think about this present moment is causing some anxiety for many of us. And many of us in public health, because...
And conservation biology.
You know, we have a certain relationship with scientific evidence, and it is threatening to think that policy decisions around the public's health could be made in defiance of the evidence. And so I wanna hold that, and I wanna center it. And also I think that what does it mean too to make room for many different truths, and that I think many of us have been trained that you pick one or the other.
Yep.
But I don't actually think that's going to get us there. I don't think that. I think that our students who are going to step into their power as the practitioners and professionals and academics of the future, you know, what does it mean for us, like, as we are sort of transitioning out of the space of, you know, the young folks and into the space of the elders? What do we want to show them? What do we want to hold for them? And that, like, you don't have to say evidence doesn't matter to be spacious.
Yes.
You don't have to, and that this sort of, Adrienne Marie Brown says, you know, like, we have to practice this loving correction, right? Where it's, you know, it isn't just replication, it isn't just reiteration, but also that we can get it wrong. That having multiple truths doesn't mean that everything is correct. And what we have to do, I think, is be so explicit about the process and so able to link how we're thinking, how we're asking, how we're assessing, how we're measuring, how we're drawing our conclusions. And if we can do some of that reflective work, it just gives us a way to sort of broaden the scope without giving up this sort of the centrality of evidence that is important to me.
And it's messy. We can teach our students to embrace the messy. That it doesn't have to be organized. Just take that, you know, paint and splatter it and enjoy it and finger paint with it, and that's okay. That's
a great kind of thought, I think, to kind of give you something to wrap up on. I mean, you want to
Are we done?
You want to empower your students to be able to embrace the messy, which I think is really, really a powerful image to help us think about what it is they need to do.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you need them to accept that, you know, there are evidences that are of importance and power, and that they need to pay attention to them. They can't just blow them off. How do you kind of...
Or if they try to, they might regret it.
Yeah. How do you help your students navigate that difficulty with which we engage the world, that we can't get so caught up in our systems, that our systems dictate back the answer, and we know what the answer is before we ask the question, and at the same time give them a framework in which they can go somewhere?
Well, I use art because I think that the scientific process parallels the art process, but for some reason, culturally, we give ourselves more permission to be messy and like bad at art. Right? Like, we encourage our kids to paint, to draw, to sketch, and we don't expect them to end up in the Louvre. But people are afraid to engage in science because, like, oh, my paper won't be good. I couldn't publish it in Nature. We have this barrier between nature and art. And in fact, my final exam for my ecology course this semester is we are going to play with the chemistry of pigments, and we're going to make cards with leaves and heat. And, you know, it's like... if you can embrace the process of art with that same joy and liberty, and it puts you in the right mindset for embracing the process of science.
That's great.
I love that, and I love this question. I think it's a beautiful question.
Thank you for it.
Yeah. I think for me, my poor students, like this, I'm sure this gets really tedious, but I always root us in the sort of fundamental question, what is happening? And what happens when we recognize that everything is storytelling, but that does not mean everything is fiction? And so I think that one of the ways that becomes really critical in public health is that we will engage with folks in community who swear up and down that something that really is not happening is happening. And what do you do? Because what does not work is to sort of brandish the evidence. I'm shaking my fist, everybody. Yes. You can't just sort of say, well, read this paper. And so I think for me, I try to model asking questions, model connecting with information. And I do a lot of reflexivity in my classes, and a lot of saying, okay, like our colleagues in English and rhetoric might call this metacognition. What is happening for you? How are you deriving this story? What are your sources of evidence? And that our evidence is not just scientific. Scientific evidence is really important, but we have sensory evidence, we have experiential evidence, we have dreamy evidence, we have imaginative evidence. And all of those evidences can be of great use. They can be really important, but we need to be very explicit about where our storylines are coming from. And I think that doing that sort of meta-reflection work and really saying, okay, first of all, what is happening and what is the story, it opens up spaces to create messy coalition at the level of knowledge making.
Perfectly stated.
And I think that that's what you're saying about art as well, is like, what does it mean to recognize that, learning itself is messy, knowledge is messy, and that really the sort of richest form of understanding our world is going to engage and weave together, I think, so many different ways of knowing. Can we recognize that it is important for us to be very explicit and specific about where those knowledges are coming from, while also holding a lot of room for that kind of like constructed negotiation of the story.
We're teaching our students how to swim in that messy pool.
Yes. Right, and to recognize, okay, like that's a seashell, that's a bubble, that's a mythical creature, and so like the CDC is not going to recognize that mythical creature because that mythical creature like is empirically unfounded, but that mythical creature may be real.
It
so
exists
what do we do?
In the mind of the community.
Yes,
so
exactly.
It has power regardless.
And so then when we're partnering with community to really create solutions, what we don't do is say, okay, well, you're saying there's a dragon there. So what we don't do is say, oh, yes, that's a dragon. Okay, like you can I don't know, you'd smoke 10 packs a day and not worry about lung cancer because there's a dragon here that says, no, you can't. But what we can say is like, look, okay, so what we know from the scientific evidence is that, if you smoke 10 packs of cigarettes a day, your likelihood of developing lung cancer is higher. And what does that dragon mean? It seems like you're really focused on that dragon, and that dragon is sending you a message about smoking, and I'm just curious about what that is. And so, what does it mean to sort of co-construct in that way and to recognize that sort of bashing someone or trying to pour in, again, like it's just not going to get us there.
And it's joyful to interact with the world in that way.
Yes.
Then playing in the mess can be fun.
Should be fun.
That is a great way to close today's conversation. That playing in the mess can be and should be fun. And thank you all so much for sharing with us how an engagement with the dragonflies in Ohio pool led us into this really fruitful conversation about what happens in our classroom and the way our students just construct the ways they learn.
Yeah.
We appreciate it very much. We hope you'll join us again on the next episode of The Deep End. And Amy and Meredith, thank you so much for sharing that interaction with us.
It was our pleasure.
This was very fun.
Thank you.